Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me also echo that too. I want to compliment the ranking member for continuing to bring this up. I wanted to talk about that just a second. Right now, we're spending about $2 billion just in the peacekeeping force in the United States. I think that's our contribution. Because of the assessment disagreement, we're some $345 million in arrears, I think, in terms of what the UN says we owe them. I'd like to point out also, Mr. Chairman, that it's not just the percentages here in relation to the size of the GDP. It's also, I think, should be taken into account the percentage of GDPs in these countries that are spent on their own military. That also bears to the global security situation. So I think given the situation we have in the U.S., Madam Ambassador, that you know, in the last few years, 35 to 40% of what we've been spending is borrowed, I think this is a very timely time to have that really serious conversation in the UN. I applaud you guys for doing that. I have two quick questions. First, I want to thank you for what you're doing. Given your high school years in Georgia, we claim you, and we're proud of what you're doing. So I want to talk about Hezbollah, and I want to talk about Lebanon in just a minute. You know, in '78, UNIFIL was created there as the interim force in Lebanon. Some 12,000 troops are there. The UN Resolution 1701 in 2006 strengthened the mandate there to monitor and to preclude the illegal transport of weapons into Lebanon, and yet we know today they have an estimated 120,000, 150,000 rockets, some of these very sophisticated guided weapons. It's very troubling. So it looks to me like that if that mandate were directed to keep weapons out of Lebanon, that they're failing against that mandate. Can you talk a little bit about their current role there, and the fact that 1701, what's their role against 1701? And then we've had reports that you know, there have been threats around reprisals if they report violations and so forth. What can we do to strengthen UNIFIL there and to preclude Lebanon from the illegal transport of these dangerous weapons?
Thank you. UNIFIL has, I think, played an ameliorative role since 2006 in calming the situation, but there's no question that Hezbollah has been able to maintain and expand an arsenal, and we have and continue to urge UNIFIL to be more aggressive in patrolling, in monitoring, in speaking out about violations of the UNIFIL mandate. And I think that what you've seen actually in recent months is at least more transparency on the part of UNIFIL. I mean, part of the challenge here is, as we know from confronting terrorist organizations in other parts of the world, when you have when you are not at war with those terrorist organizations, you are using political pressure, particularly by Lebanon's own sovereign institutions, which are themselves very weak, as we know from the current paralysis in Lebanon. You are shining a spotlight. You are trying to ensure interdiction of weapons before they even get into the theater in question. So UNIFIL is not a perfect fix for everything that ails Lebanon or for the threat posed by Hezbollah, but it has a responsibility to be vocal and to take very seriously its reporting mandate, also so countries in the region, including our friends, know what is happening in an area from which threats have come routinely in recent decades.
Also, let me just ask you to add a comment or two about in Syria. The UN Disengagement Observation Force, UNDOF, has actually withdrawn from the Golan on the Syrian side because of the fighting there. Can you speak to their role now, and how are they interacting with IDF in that? And I have one last question.
Thank you. I mean, you're right that there's been a reconfiguration. This is something UNDOF has done in close consultation with the government of Israel, given the stakes here. It is a response to the fact that al-Nusra made advances, on one side of the line, and we. Right now, this is
actually kidnapped some of the UN forces.
Exactly, Senator. They did, and the release of those forces had to be negotiated. And I will say, even that incident showed it's not the same as civilian protection, but an unevenness in how the different units responded, which again is life in the UN. Some holding onto their weapons, refusing to be cowed. Others handing over their weapons, and unfortunately, in a manner that left UNDOF weaker, and where those weapons had to be replenished. But we again view this as a temporary relocation. We still believe the prior configuration is the stabilizing configuration, but I think the Israelis are well aware as well that the circumstances don't lend themselves to putting the observers on the other side of the line.
The last question I have, with time remaining, Ambassador, is the chairman mentioned it, but the violations of Iran, we've been concerned since the JCPOA that Iran would violate our agreement incrementally. They're violating the UN agreement, not incrementally, but in a major way. These are Resolution 1929 and 2231. With the launch in October, and then we have reports just the last week or so of a second launch. What's the UN doing in relation to those violations and the sanctions that back those up?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, this is something that I've had occasion to talk to the chairman about, and it's music to a UN ambassador's ears when Resolution 1929, Resolution 2231 just roll off the tongue of members of Congress. Resolution 1929 has been an incredibly important foundation to the international sanctions regime. The ballistic missile launch from October is a violation of 1929. As soon as we confirmed the launch, we brought it to the Security Council. We now are going to be discussing it on Tuesday. The UN machinery, as always, works slowly. The panel of experts is looking at it. We've provided all the information that we have on it. And, in a way, the Security Council is an important venue for increasing the political costs on Iran when they violate Resolution 1929. I would note, of course, that the JCPOA is aimed at dismantling Iran's nuclear weapons program, so that the threat that Iran poses in any aspect of its military is much diminished. The Security Council sanctions body operates by consensus. This is something that over time benefits the United States, but on something like that, it means we have to convince all members of the committee also to support our desired designations or any further form of accountability.
So what is the U.S. trying to move forward in terms of strengthening the sanctions?
Well, we've got to get, it's just UN machinery. We're going to get the report back from the panel of experts. We'll discuss it in the committee, and then we'll look at what the right tool is. I think it's very important also to look at the bilateral tools we have. We maintain sanctions, as you know, and will, even after implementation day, on ballistic missiles, on counterterrorism, on human rights, and I think many of the individuals involved in their ballistic missile program have already been sanctioned, as you well know, over the years. So trying to secure a nexus between this launch and any particular individual and entity is a challenge that we need to take on. But I think looking at the Security Council and our bilateral tools as complementary is very important in this regard.
Thank you. Thank you again for your service.
Thank you,
Mr.
Senator.
Chairman.
Thank you.